The document landed on the desk at 11 minutes past midnight. No cover letter, no summary, just 412 pages of numbers that were never supposed to leave the third floor of the Apostolic Palace. And somewhere between page 67 and page 91, there was a gap, a clean surgical gap. Someone had erased 3 years of financial transactions from the Vatican's own records. And the man sitting behind that desk, the man who had just returned from a 2-day consistory, where he looked 120 cardinals in the eye and asked for their loyalty, that man picked up a red pen, circled the gap, and whispered 3 words to himself, "Not this time." His name is Robert Francis Prevost. The world calls him Pope Leo XIV, and what he was about to do in the next 72 hours would set off the most significant financial confrontation inside the Vatican since the Banco Ambrosiano scandal nearly destroyed the church in 1982. This story begins on the night of June 29, 2026. Rome was suffocating under a summer heat wave. Temperatures hadn't dropped below 35 degrees in 4 days. The streets around St. Peter's were mostly empty by 10 o'clock at night. Tourists had retreated to air-conditioned hotels. Even the Swiss Guard looked like they were melting in their Renaissance uniforms. But inside the Domus Sanctae Marthae, where Leo has lived since the day he was elected, there was no rest. There was no sleep. There was a war being planned. Before we go on, if this story grabs you, take a second to hit subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. Now, back to what happened that night. For months, Leo had been receiving briefings about the Vatican's internal financial architecture, not the public reports, not the glossy annual statements the Vatican's economy ministry publishes for European regulators, the real ones, the ones that showed where Peter's Pence donations actually went, the ones that tracked how the Secretariat of State, the Vatican's most powerful bureaucratic arm, had quietly rebuilt its financial influence after Pope Francis stripped it of control following the disastrous London property deal. And Leo, the Chicago-born math major, the man who could read a balance sheet faster than most of his cardinals could read a homily, Leo saw the pattern immediately. The Vatican's financial watchdog, the agency called XIV, had been designed to be independent. It was supposed to monitor everything: money laundering, terrorist financing, suspicious transactions flowing through the Institute for the Works of Religion, commonly known as the Vatican Bank. But its structure had a fatal flaw. The president and the board were political appointments. They answered to the same curial ecosystem they were supposed to police. It was like asking the fox to audit the hen house and then giving the fox a corner office. Francis had tried to fix this. Had created oversight bodies, reformed accounting standards, pushed through a historic corruption trial that landed Cardinal Angelo Becciu with a 5.5-year prison sentence and millions in fines. But Francis was also fighting cancer, battling pneumonia, and running out of time. When he died on April 21, 2025, the reforms were still unfinished. The deficit was still hemorrhaging. The pension fund was still a ticking bomb. And the men who had always controlled the money, the career curialists, the Italian-born bureaucrats who had spent decades navigating the Vatican's labyrinthine power structure, they were waiting, patient, confident, because they had outlasted every reformer before. But what they didn't count on was Leo. Here's what most people don't understand about Robert Francis Prevost. He doesn't look like a revolutionary. He speaks softly. He smiles easily. He has the calm demeanor of a professor who's seen every exam trick in the book. But underneath that Augustinian patience, there's a mind that thinks in systems. He ran his global religious order twice. He managed budgets across 4 continents. He spent years in Peru in the Diocese of Chiclayo, where he learned what happens when institutions decay from the inside. People suffer. The poor suffer. And the truth gets buried under marble and gold. So when Leo sat down on the night of June 29th and reviewed those 412 pages, he wasn't just reading numbers. He was reading a story. A story about an institution that had been talking about transparency for 15 years, while quietly making sure the real power stayed exactly where it always been. And he decided that the talking was over. The first call went out at 6 o'clock in the morning on June 30th. Leo's private secretary contacted the prefect of the Secretariat for the Economy. The message was simple: clear the schedule. The Pope needed the conference room in the Palazzo San Carlo by 9 o'clock. No agenda was circulated. No briefing papers were distributed. Just a summons. But what happened next surprised even Leo's closest advisors. By 8:30, word had leaked. In the Vatican, secrets have a half-life shorter than a Roman summer thunderstorm. 3 senior officials from the Secretariat of State made calls to each other within minutes. A retired cardinal who still maintained an office near the Cortile del Belvedere was seen making his way toward the Apostolic Palace at a pace that suggested urgency rather than devotion. and an Italian Monsignor who served as a liaison between ASIF's outgoing board and the Council for the Economy sent a text message to a colleague that would later be described in Vatican corridors as panicked. The text said simply, "Hess moving today, not next month, today." Leo arrived at the conference room at exactly 9 o'clock. He wore his white cassock, no ceremonial stole, no ring of the fisherman on display, just the cassock and a leather folder. He sat down. Across from him sat 6 men. 3 were financial officials from the economy ministry. 1 was a canon lawyer who specialized in Vatican administrative law. 2 were external consultants, 1 from Brussels, 1 from Washington, who had been quietly working with the Vatican since February on a review of ASIF's operational structure. Leo opened the folder. Inside was a draft of a new 12-article statute. He slid copies across the table. "Read it," he said, "then tell me what we are missing." The room went silent. The statute was radical. It eliminated the ASIF president entirely. Gone. It dissolved the board. Gone. In their place, a director and a deputy director, both appointed directly by the Pope for 5-year terms. No more political appointments, no more curial horse trading. The Pope would choose, the Pope would remove. And the agency's reports would now flow directly to the Council for the Economy, not through the Secretariat of State's filtering hands. But there was more. The statute expanded ASIF's jurisdiction. Previously, the agency could only arbitrate disputes between Vatican bank users and the bank's payment systems. Under the new rules, ASIF would oversee the entire spectrum of the bank's financial services. Every account, every transaction, every wire, transfer to every diocese and religious order on earth that moved money through the Vatican bank's books. One of the financial officials looked up from the document. His face had gone pale. "Your Holiness," he said carefully, "this effectively ends the board's authority overnight." Leo nodded. "That's the point." And that single sentence, that calm, measured, devastatingly clear response, is the moment that defined what happened next. Within the hour the statute was finalized, Leo signed it personally. His signature, firm, unhesitating, in the American style that still looked foreign on Vatican documents, went on the bottom of the chirograph. The formal introduction he wrote was precise. Transparency, integrity, and accountability in economic and financial activities are indispensable elements of good governance and service to the common good. These must characterize the institutions of the Holy See and of the Vatican City-State. But the words were only part of the message. The real message was the speed. Leo had taken what would normally be a 6-month bureaucratic process, consultations, drafts, counterdrafts, curial objections, diplomatic delays, and compressed it into one morning. He had reviewed the document, gathered his team, signed the statute, and sent it to the press office before the Angelus bell rang at noon. Why the rush? Because Leo understood something that his predecessors had learned the hard way. In the Vatican, delay is defeat. Every week a reform sits on a desk is a week for opponents to organize. Every month is a month for anonymous leaks to Italian newspapers. Every year is a year for the old guard to wait out the reformer and hope he gets tired, gets sick, or gets distracted by a more pressing crisis. Leo wasn't going to give them a single, but the ASIF overhaul was only the beginning. Because tucked into that same Tuesday's announcements, a day that Vatican reporters would later call the most legislatively productive day of Leo's pontificate, was another decree, a motu proprio. This one adjusted the governing structure of the Vicariate of Rome itself. Leo reaffirmed the cardinal vicar's powers, but created a new position, a moderator curiae, appointed by the Pope for a 5-year term, responsible for the day-to-day coordination of all administrative offices. Translation: Leo was installing his own people in the operational machinery of the Rome diocese. The cardinal vicar would keep his title, his authority, his public role, but the gears, the hiring, the budgets, the scheduling, the actual administration would now run through someone Leo personally chose and could personally remove. The walls were closing in on the old system, and the men who had built their careers inside that system could feel it. What happened behind closed doors that afternoon was something the Vatican will probably never officially confirm, but multiple sources, people who were present in the corridors of the Apostolic Palace, people who received phone calls from cardinals who were in Rome for the consistory, described a scene that was unprecedented in recent papal history. A group of senior Italian curial officials requested an audience with Leo. Not a formal audience, not a scheduled meeting, an urgent, informal conversation. The kind of meeting that in Vatican culture signals deep institutional distress. Leo agreed to see them. He met them in the library of the Apostolic Palace at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The meeting lasted 47 minutes. What was said inside that room was communicated afterward in fragments. through intermediaries, through the coded language that Vatican insiders use when they want information to circulate without being traced. But the fragments tell a clear story. The officials argued that the reforms were too fast, that the elimination of ASIF's board removed an important layer of institutional memory, that the expansion of oversight authority could create friction with the Vatican Bank's existing management, that the timing, days before the Pope was scheduled to travel to Lampedusa, suggested these were not fully considered decisions, but political moves designed to consolidate control while the world's attention was focused elsewhere. Leo listened. He let them finish. He didn't interrupt, and when they were done, he responded with a question. Who did these structures serve? Silence. Did they serve the faithful who donate their money expecting it to fund the mission of the Church? Or did they serve the men who sat on those boards and managed those accounts and never once had to answer to anyone outside this building? More silence. Then Leo said something that would be repeated in Vatican corridors for weeks. He said, "I have a degree in mathematics. I spent 20 years managing a global religious order. I have read every financial report this institution has produced since 2010. And I can tell you with the precision of someone who has spent his life with numbers, the structures we inherited were not designed for transparency. They were designed for protection, and not the protection of the Church." The meeting ended. The officials left. No one shook hands. No one smiled. They walked out of the library in single file, past the Swiss guard who stood motionless by the door, past the frescoed corridor that had witnessed centuries of papal decisions that rewrote history. One of the officials, a man who had in the Curia for over 30 years, who had survived 4 pontificates and 2 financial scandals, paused near the elevator. He turned to a colleague and said in Italian something that would be repeated in whispered conversations across the Vatican for days. "He's not going to stop." His colleague didn't respond. There was nothing to say. They both knew it was true. That evening, Leo ate dinner alone in his room at the Domus Sanctae Marthae. Pasta, mineral water, a piece of fruit. His staff had learned early in his pontificate that Leo preferred simplicity in his meals. No formal dining room, no silver service, just a tray, a table, and whatever he was reading. On this night, he was reading the financial reports from the Vatican Bank's most recent quarterly disclosure. He had marked certain pages with small adhesive tabs, yellow for questions, red for anomalies, blue for items that needed immediate follow-up. There were red tabs. But the resistance didn't stop. It simply changed form. Over the next 48 hours, something subtle but unmistakable began happening in Rome's media ecosystem. Italian-language news outlets started running commentary pieces, questioning whether the American Pope truly understood the traditions and sensitivities of the Roman Curia. Anonymous sources, always anonymous, always unnamed senior Vatican officials, suggested that Leo was moving too quickly, that he was imposing an American corporate mentality on an institution that had functioned for 2,000 years. It was a familiar playbook. The same strategy had been used against Francis. The same strategy had been used against George Pell when he tried to reform Vatican finances in 2014. The same strategy had been used against Libero Maloney, the Auditor General, who was fired in 2017 after he got too close to the truth about where the money was going. The strategy had worked before. It had broken reformers. It had silenced auditors. It had turned allies into enemies and made brave men cautious. For decades, the Vatican's internal financial network had operated like an immune system, not against corruption, but against reform. Any foreign body that entered the system was identified, isolated, and expelled. Pell was sent back to Australia to face charges that were eventually overturned. Maloney was pressured out of his office and told he would face criminal prosecution if he spoke publicly. Even Francis, with all his moral authority, found his momentum stalling after his key financial lieutenants were removed. The pattern was always the same. Step 1, question the reformers' competence. Step 2, question their motives. Step 3, wait. Because the Vatican doesn't run on years, it runs on centuries, and centuries always win, until now. But Leo had something his predecessors didn't. He had the credibility of results. In December 2025, just 7 months after taking office, Leo had already dismantled the controversial fundraising commission that was announced while Francis lay in a hospital bed with double pneumonia. That commission, staffed entirely by Italian officials with no fundraising experience, led by a Secretariat of State appointee from the very office that had lost tens of millions of euros in the London property scandal, had been widely seen as an attempt by the old guard to recapture financial control while the papacy was vulnerable. Leo didn't negotiate. He didn't form a committee to study the commission. He suppressed it. He abrogated its statutes. He fired its members. and he decreed that all its assets would be transferred to the Holy See as a whole, with the Vatican Patrimony Office overseeing its extinction. That move had sent a message, but it was a private message understood only by insiders. The XIV overhaul was different. This was public, this was structural, this was permanent, and this was the moment when Leo went from being a cautious reformer to something the Vatican hadn't seen in decades, a pope who was willing to dismantle the machinery of institutional protection in real time, with his name on every document, while the men who built that machinery watched. The numbers told part of the story. The Vatican's Peter's Pence collection for 2025 had taken in 57.6 million euros. It spent 59.8 million, a 2.2 million euro deficit. Individual donations from the faithful were declining. People were tired of reading about scandals and seeing no consequences. They were tired of hearing about pension fund, black holes, and structural deficits, and London property deals gone wrong. They wanted to know that their money was being used to help people, not to fund the bureaucratic machinery of a medieval court dressed in modern accounting language. Leo understood this. He understood it not as a theologian, not as a pastor, but as a mathematician. The numbers were telling him that the church was losing its donors' trust, and without trust, there was no money, and without money, there was no mission. The 252 direct assistance projects in 74 countries that Peter's Pence funded, schools in Africa, hospitals in Asia, refugee programs in the Middle East, those projects depended on the faithful believing that their donations weren't disappearing into a curial black box. So, when Leo signed the XIV statute, he wasn't just reforming a bureaucratic agency. He was trying to save the church financial soul. The consistory that preceded the reforms had been the second extraordinary meeting of cardinals Leo called in 2026 alone. For 2 days, cardinals from every continent gathered in Rome. Leo sat with them. He listened to their reports. He heard about challenges in their dioceses, declining attendance in Europe, explosive growth in Africa, political persecution in parts of Asia, deepening poverty in Latin America. And then he told them something remarkable. He told them that his ministry, the ministry of the Bishop of Rome, could not be carried out alone. He asked for their support, not passive support, not diplomatic silence. He used specific words, strong, explicit, and public. It was a line drawn in the sand. Leo was telling every cardinal in the room that neutrality was no longer an option. You were either with the reforms, or you were against them. And if you were against them, you needed to say so publicly, not through anonymous briefings to Italian journalists. Some cardinals responded with enthusiasm. The reformists, many of them appointed by Francis, saw in Leo a continuation of the mission they had been called to serve. Others responded with cautious compliance, the Vatican equivalent of a polite smile that means nothing. And a small but influential group responded with the kind of silence that in Vatican culture speaks louder than any words. But Leo had already anticipated the silence. That's why the reforms were signed before the consistory ended. The decrees were already at the press office before the cardinals left Rome. By the time anyone could organize opposition, the statute was published, the appointments were made, and the old XIV board was already history. It was a masterclass in institutional chess. And the man playing it was a 69-year-old Augustinian friar from Chicago who spent most of his career in countries where chess was a luxury and survival was the game. On July 1st, as the news broke worldwide about the scope of Leo's reforms, something unexpected happened in the Vatican's financial ecosystem. The Vatican Bank, the Institute for the Works of Religion, released a statement. It was brief, it was formal. It expressed full cooperation with the new regulatory framework. That was significant. The IOR had spent decades resisting oversight. Its history was stained with the Banco Ambrosiano collapse, with mafia connections, with the mysterious death of Roberto Calvi, found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London in 1982. The bank had been forced into reforms by European regulators, who threatened to cut off its access to international banking systems. It had closed over 1,000 suspicious accounts in 2014 alone. But cooperation from the IOR had always been grudging, minimal, just enough to satisfy regulators without actually changing the culture. This time, the language was different. The statement didn't just promise compliance. It acknowledged the expanded jurisdiction. XIV would now hold over all its financial services. It accepted the new arbitration rules. It welcomed the director-led governance model. Why the sudden change? Because the IOR's leadership had done the math too. They knew that Leo's reforms weren't aimed at shutting down the Vatican Bank. They were aimed at making it legitimate, truly legitimate, not just technically compliant with European anti-money laundering standards, but operationally transparent in a way that would restore the confidence of the Church's biggest donors, the Americans, the Germans, the foundations that controlled billions in charitable assets and had been watching the Vatican's financial chaos with growing skepticism. If the IOR cooperated, it survived. If it resisted, Leo had shown he was willing to dismantle institutions. The fundraising commission was proof. The XIV board was proof. There was no reason to believe the IOR would be exempt. By July 2nd, the reforms had generated a wave of analysis in Catholic media and international financial press. Commentators noted that the new XIV statute incorporated principles from the European Union's 6th Anti-Money Laundering Directive. It aligned with the Egmont Group statute adopted in November 2025. It created a new head of legal affairs position to ensure consistency across departments. It established clear reporting lines that ran directly to a council with the authority to demand answers. This wasn't window dressing. This was an American-trained mathematician redesigning the Vatican's financial immune system from the inside. But the most revealing moment came not in any official document or press release. It came on July 3rd, the night before Leo was scheduled to fly to Lampedusa. Leo was in his private chapel at the Domus Sanctae Marthae. It was late. The building was quiet. He had spent the day reviewing final preparations for the Lampedusa visit, a trip that carried its own political weight, revisiting the island that Francis had made famous as a symbol of the migrant crisis. But this was different. Leo wasn't going to Lampedusa just to pray. He was going to stand on the shores of the Mediterranean and speak about what it means when institutions fail the people they are supposed to protect. And those words about institutions failing people were not just about immigration policy or European border control. They were about everything. They were about the pension fund that couldn't meet its obligations. They were about the donations that disappeared into curial administrative costs. They were about the London property deal where the Secretariat of State lost tens of millions on a luxury building, while parishes in developing countries couldn't afford to keep their doors open. A member of Leo's household staff later described the scene that evening. The Pope was sitting at his desk, not the formal desk in the study, the small wooden desk he kept near the window that looks out toward the gardens. He had a notepad in front of him. He was writing by hand, not a speech, not a decree, something personal, something he folded and placed inside his breviary before closing it for the night. No one knows what he wrote. No one has asked. But the people who know Leo, the Augustinian brothers who lived with him in Peru, the staff who worked with him in the dicastery for bishops, the seminarians who studied under him in Indianapolis decades ago, they all say the same thing about him. They say he writes to himself when the weight of a decision becomes personal, when the numbers stop being numbers and start being people, when the deficit isn't just a line on a ledger, but a school that closes, a hospital that runs out of medicine, a family that goes hungry because the institution that was supposed to help them was too busy protecting its own. The next morning before dawn, Leo walked to his private chapel. He prayed for 20 minutes. Then he stood, straightened his cassock, and walked to the car waiting outside. His security detail noticed something they had seen before, on mornings when Leo was about to do something significant. His jaw was set, his eyes were focused, and he carried no papers. He had already decided everything he needed to decide. The rest was execution. Leo boarded a plane for Lampedusa. He celebrated Mass on the island. He visited the Gateway to Europe monument. He walked through the cemetery where migrants who died at sea are buried in unmarked graves. And during his homily, he spoke about the parable of the Good Samaritan. He said that Lampedusa lies along a path as dangerous as the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. He said that the encounter with those who lie before us, stripped of everything, calls us to be close to them. But the people who were paying attention, the Vatican watchers, the financial analysts, the cardinals back in Rome, who were still processing the shock of what had happened on June 30th, they heard something else in those words. They heard a pope who was talking about more than migrants. He was talking about what happens when powerful men turn away from suffering, because confronting it would mean confronting themselves. And that's exactly what Leo had done with the XIV reforms. He had confronted the men who controlled the Vatican's money. He had looked at the structures they built to protect themselves. And he didn't blink. Back in Rome, the ripple effects of June 30th were still spreading. Inside the Vatican's administrative offices, staff who had worked under the old XIV structure were receiving new directives. Job descriptions were being rewritten. Reporting chains were being reorganized. The bureaucratic equivalent of an earthquake had struck, and the aftershocks were felt in every department that had any connection to financial oversight. Some officials cooperated immediately. These were often the younger staff, the professionals hired during the Francis-era reform push, who had always felt frustrated by the institutional resistance they encountered. They saw Leo's moves as a vindication, proof that someone at the top was finally willing to match words with action. Others resisted in the only way Vatican officials know how, through slow compliance. They responded to directives with requests for clarification. They asked for meetings that didn't need to happen. They submitted paperwork with deliberate ambiguities that would require additional review cycles. It was bureaucratic guerrilla warfare, invisible to the outside world, but devastatingly effective at grinding institutional change to a halt. Leo saw through it immediately. Within days, he instructed the prefect of the Secretariat for the Economy to flag any department that missed its compliance deadline. The flags would go directly to the Pope's desk, not through intermediaries, not through committee review, directly. It was the equivalent of a CEO telling every middle manager in the company, "I am watching your inbox." In the days after Lampedusa, the reaction across the Catholic world was split. Liberal Catholic commentators praised Leo as the most financially literate pope in modern history, a leader finally bringing the same standards of accountability that any modern institution would take for granted. Conservative critics accused him of centralizing power, of replacing a flawed system with one that concentrated even more authority in the papal office. Some Italian media outlets continued their campaign of anonymous sourcing, suggesting internal discontent, but the numbers told a different story. In the week following the XIV announcement, the Vatican's economy ministry reported an uptick in inquiries from international Catholic foundations about new giving structures. Two major American Catholic philanthropic organizations that had paused donations during the Francis years initiated preliminary conversations about resuming contributions. And the Council for the Economy, the body that would now receive XIV's annual reports, announced it would publish a public summary of its review findings for the first time in its history. The transparency Leo had demanded was beginning to produce results, not because people suddenly trusted the Vatican, but because they trusted the man behind the desk, the man with a math degree, the man who had shown in the space of 72 hours that he would sign his name to every reform, face every opponent personally, and never hide behind the anonymity of a curial committee. There's a phrase Leo used during the consistory that has stayed with the cardinals who heard it. He said, "This church will not choose comfort over truth, not while I sit in this chair." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a political declaration. It was a promise, made quietly, made firmly, made by a man who spent his entire life preparing for a fight he never expected to have. The men who control the Vatican's money have survived popes before. They survived Paul VI. They survived John Paul II. They survived Benedict. They partially survived Francis. They have centuries of institutional patience. They know how to wait, but Leo is not waiting. Leo is not forming study groups. Leo is not issuing aspirational documents that will be debated for years and forgotten. Leo is signing statutes. Leo is firing boards. Leo is appointing directors who answer to him. And he is doing it on his day off before anyone in the Curia has finished their morning coffee. That's what makes this different, not the reforms themselves. Every pope since the Banco Ambrosiano collapse has attempted some version of financial reform. What makes this different is the speed, the precision, and the refusal to negotiate with people who were never negotiating in good faith. The Vatican's financial crisis isn't over. The pension fund still faces a shortfall estimated between 1 and 2 billion euros. The structural deficit, while halved, still exists. The culture of financial opacity built over centuries won't vanish because of one statute, but something shifted on June 30th, 2026. Something fundamental. The rules changed. The power changed. The man behind the desk changed. And for the first time in a very long time, the men who controlled the money looked across the table and saw someone who understood their numbers better than they did. And that terrified them more than any sermon ever could. If this story moved you, if you want to keep following what happens next inside the Vatican, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the bell. Leave a comment. Tell me what you think Leo should do next. Because this fight is far from over, and the next chapter is already being written.